It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Back for the second year in a row, we have Kristine Moncada. Chris has been a researcher in the University of Minnesota Department of Horticultural Science since 2017. She works with the turf grass science team on projects that include low input turf, lawn water conservation, roadside turf, and bee lawns. She is an avid gardener with a passionate interest in pollinating insects. Chris, we are so excited to have you here today, and we look forward to hearing everything you can tell us about our topic of the practical ways to implement having a bee lawn.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Oops, hold on one second. Do it this way. Okay, I hope everything looks good there.
It looks great.
Thanks for the nice introduction. So I won't go into my background too much. It looks like it was covered very well already. So I am a researcher at the University of Minnesota. I like to mention my hobbies because it all ties together. So I like to grow vegetables, like to grow native plants. And I also am interested in pollinators. So when you grow things like native plants, that attracts pollinators, and that's a great way to incorporate pollinators into your landscape. So I always say my motto is, as far as gardening is concerned, is food for me and food for bees. So I like to grow vegetables for me, and I like to grow native plants for the bees. I do have a link to a PDF with all the resources that I'm going to discuss in this slide or in this presentation. So that includes my slides. It includes a lot of website links that I'll refer to as we go along. In particular, one of the very best resources that for bee lawns is planting and maintaining a bee lawn, and that's from the University of Minnesota Extension. So afterwards, if you want to read even more about bee lawns, that's probably the best place to go. Okay, so I give a lot of bee lawn presentations, and this one's a little bit different. I'm not going to talk a lot about the bee lawn plants so much, and not so much about the insects. I'm going to concentrate on the establishment of a bee lawn. So I do want to just review a little bit so people know what I'm talking about when I say a bee lawn. So a bee lawn is a low input lawn that's intentionally managed and or planted with forbs and or legumes that have flowers on which pollinators can forage for nectar and pollen. So that means not just any flower in a lawn, it has to be a flower that's good for pollinators. Pollinators can include not just bees, they can include butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, beetles. So like anything that's using the nectar and pollen and actually helps plants pollinate is a pollinator. So when I say low input means a type of lawn where you use less fertilizer, you use less water, and you mow less frequently. And that's because of the species that you use. A traditional lawn would be considered more of a high input lawn. And then when I talk about forbs and legumes, forbs just means a non-grassy flowering plant. And legumes is a member of the legume family. And legumes are important because they generally fix nitrogen, which is a very important attribute that people can utilize. And it helps in a bee lawn as well. So the University of Minnesota has been doing bee lawn research for about 10 years now. So the flowers that the research was conducted with include self-heal, creeping thyme, and white clover. The turf grasses, you can use, you have a couple of different options for turf grasses. So there's the vine fescues, which are low input species, and then Kentucky bluegrass, which is more of a traditionally used turf grass. There are other researchers that are in other parts of the country. They're doing their own pollinator lawn types of research, and they are working on different species. But for the sake of this presentation and for the sake of our region, which is, you know, the Midwest, these are the species that I mean when we're talking about bee lawns. So just to look at these species a little more closely. The first one that we have here is self-heal, and that has a larger inflorescence with purple flowers. There's creeping thyme, so that has very small little pink flowers. And white clover, I'm sure almost everyone here is familiar with white clover. That has kind of medium-sized inflorescence with white flowers. And then the fine fescues, some people aren't familiar with those, but the fine fescues are a different type of turf grass that are considered low input. So in the picture here, you can see why they're called fine fescues. They have a very narrow, fine leaf. So for this talk, like I mentioned, it's not going to be talking so much about the insects or very specifics on the species. It's going to be a little bit more on how to establish a bee lawn. And actually, this is a really important topic because if people don't have a green thumb, something like establishing a bee lawn can be challenging, and people have questions about that. So we'll talk about planting times, whether to overseed or renovate, and some kind of other little details for establishment. I'll talk a little bit about bee lawn mix options, and then some recommendations for different types of sites. And then as I talk, we have new research that we're conducting at the University of Minnesota, and I'll kind of mix that in a little bit so you can see where we're going with our research. So the first question that people should decide when they plant a bee lawn is when they're going to plant it. So there are two main times that we recommend to plant. So the first is spring. So that's just like when you're planting other things in your garden in the spring when it's time to plant. Another option, and this might be a little bit more unfamiliar to people, is dormant seeding. So this is planting seed after the growing season is over. So that would mean like late fall to early winter. And that's going to vary a little bit depending on the year. And people, I'm sure you've noticed, some years we have very unusual conditions like we did this past winter. Other options that you might think of for establishing a lawn are fall, because that's when actually, you know, probably your extension educators recommend fall planting for your regular lawn. Unfortunately, while that's the best for turf grasses, that's not the best for the forbs that are in a bee lawn. One other option is summer. I'll discuss that. We haven't done any research on summer establishment, so I'll just kind of discuss whether that is an option or not. So for spring seeding, like I said, this is when you're planting other things in your garden as well. So you want to seed after the risk of frost. In our area here in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, that's usually mid to late May. That may vary depending on where you're located. So a spring seeding is very good for the forbs that are in a bee lawn mix. They have plenty of time to establish and grow and get ready throughout the season to survive the winter that comes later in the year. It's an okay time for turf grasses. Like I said, fall is a little bit better for turf grasses to establish, but spring is fine as well. So there are some disadvantages to spring seeding. You do need to have a very regular watering regimen for a spring seeding. And then that's going to vary a little bit depending on what kind of conditions are happening. If it's raining, you get in the spring, you get to skip a watering here and there. But for me, and the biggest challenge with spring seeding is the weeds. So you're planting mid-May to early May or to late May. And that's when all of the weeds are germinating as well. So you can see in this picture, there's all these different annual weeds that are germinating, like lamb's quarters and ragweed. And then there's perennial weeds like dandelions. So you have to deal with those in your seeding. Unfortunately, or depending on your point of view, you can't use herbicides for in this case, like you might with a regular lawn, because most herbicides are targeting these weeds. They're also going to target your flowers that you're trying to get established in your bee lawn. So the second main option for seeding is dormant seeding. So that means late fall to winter. That means after things have stopped growing for the year and you're certain that things are stopped growing for the year. You're putting down seed and you do not intend for it to grow within that year. You're waiting for the following year for it to grow. So both the turf grasses and the flowers of a bee lawn are adapted to dormant seeding. I'm a big fan of dormant seeding because it's way less work. It's basically you put down the seed, you don't really need to do too much until the next year. So the University of Minnesota does have a website, a web page on dormant seeding. So if you want to learn more about dormant seeding for lawns in general or for bee lawns, you can look there. So dormant seeding does have a few disadvantages. So if you have a winter where you have a hot spell or a warm spell, where the soil gets warmed up enough that seed can germinate, it can germinate too early. And then if you get like a hard freeze after that, it can kill your delicate seedlings that have germinated. Again, a dormant seeding is the seed is sitting there all winter. So as you can imagine, if there's birds and rodents that are interested in eating that seed, they could do that. Unprotected seed can wash away. So sometimes we don't get very much snow over winter. And sometimes we can have a rainstorm in winter. So things like that can happen. In this picture, this is actually from my yard. And I was trying to fill in the spot by dormant seeding. And then a squirrel was spending a lot of time digging acorns and disturbing the seed because it was just bare soil. So you can't really blame the squirrel for doing that. So another option is summer seeding. So it's really not the optimal time to do a bee lawn. It can be done and it can work, but if you think about like an August seeding, that's the hottest time of year. And also, at least in our area, it's the driest time of year. So a summer seeding would need lots of watering. And August may not be enough time for the forbs to establish in order to make it through the winter. So in particular, I worry about creeping thyme. It has a kind of an erratic germination where it might not germinate in time. It might germinate too late and not have enough growth to make it over the winter. But with summer seeding, at least you're avoiding those spring weeds like you would have in a spring seeding. So now I'm going to talk about kind of like ways to establish. So you have two choices, overseeding or renovating. So with overseeding, you're using your existing lawn and you're planting within that lawn. With renovating, you are starting completely from scratch. And as you can imagine, renovating is a lot more work. So with overseeding, why you might choose one over the other. With overseeding, if you have a healthy lawn and you're happy with your lawn, but you just want bee lawn flowers in there, that's you might choose just to overseed. Like I mentioned, it is less work, and potentially you could be using less seed. For example, if you just wanted to add some flowers, you could just use the forbs, like a mix that just contains the forbs. So renovating, when would you renovate? If your lawn is not a healthy, good looking lawn, you might want to start from scratch. So if your lawn is weeds, if your lawn has a lot of bare spots, if you want to correct issues with your lawn in general, like if you have an uneven lawn or a compacted lawn, if you want to correct grading, starting from scratch is a great time to do that. Another reason you might want to renovate is if you have Kentucky bluegrass. That's what we consider a high input turf grass. And if you want a little less work on your lawn, like maybe mowing less and watering less, you might want to convert that to low input fine fescues. And that's within our bee lawn mix that you can buy. So the steps in overseeding, you want to mow very short. So the goal here is really you're trying to damage or set back your existing turf, because otherwise the things that you're planting within that turf won't have a chance. So what you're looking for is some bare soil within your lawn. You want to free up some bare soil for the new seed that you're going to plant. So if your lawn is vigorously growing and you mow it short, you might have a lot of clippings. So you want to remove those. Again, it's an issue of freeing up that bare soil. So for overseeding, you don't need to do a lot more than mowing it. You can get away with having that be your main step, is just mowing it short. So I do mention here, seeding blankets aren't needed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those are when we talk about renovation. So renovating, the toughest part of renovating for me is getting rid of that vegetation. So that can be a lot of work. So like I said, renovating is starting from scratch, and to start from scratch, you need a nice seed bed for that seed to grow in. So ways to remove that existing turf. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can do something like sheet mulching, which is like putting layers of newspaper or cardboard, and that over time smothers the turf. You can use solarization. That is using a clear plastic that you put over your the turf, and over time the heat and the drought and the sun just kill the turf under there. You can use a non-selective herbicide, and what non-selective means is something like glyphosate, and that kills pretty much most plants. So you can do something like that. That's probably the fastest way to renovate. Or, there's things called like sod cutters. We have a picture here at our research center of a sod cutter. That's a machine that just takes off that top layer. There's also something that's called a sod kicker. So that's kind of like like a sod cutter, except you're basically kicking this little tool to get under the turf and remove it that way. So as you can imagine, something like a sod kicker is a lot of work. So next up, once you've removed that vegetation or killed that vegetation is seed bed prep. So there's a lot of ways to do seed bed prep. So something that is recommended, especially if you have compacted soil, is to use an aerator, and I have a picture here of an aerator. So that can help with compacted soil. You run that aerator over the site. It's removing little plugs of soil, and it's helping, that helps relieve compaction. So if you, like, for example, used glyphosate to kill your turf, and there's a lot of residue there, something like a power rake, it's these little things that, little blades that kind of break up that residue that's on your soil. That's another tool that you can use to make the seed bed ready for that seed. We have these videos, which I highly recommend. They're just for a regular lawn conversion, but the same principles apply for a bee lawn as well. So I would encourage you to watch those videos for all of the details, all of the different machines that you can use and prepare your seed bed for planting. But it's the same thing as in overseeding. You're trying to have you want some bare soil, and you want good soil to seed contact to the seed that you're going to be planting, so that it has a nice place to germinate. So with renovating, as I mentioned, if you need things that correcting of your lawn, as far as like grading, or if you have depressions that you want to fill in, this is the time to do that. You can do things like add your topsoil. And then, probably as a final step for seed bed prep would be to rake things, and so they're level and nice. And you don't want things to be too, I'm going to call it fluffy, because the seed won't have a good contact to the soil. So we're at the point where you can actually seed now. So You can do things like use a drop or a broadcast seeder for large areas. Here on the right-hand side here, this is our research station and us planting research plots. And so for small areas, there's no reason you can't hand seed. You establish how much seed you need for that area, and then you just make sure to spread it evenly. So depending on the size of your area, you can do things either way. So, so the seeding rate for using just kind of the off-the-shelf B-lawn mix will be like 4 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And I have from the University of Minnesota Extension website, we kind of have an example amount that you can use for the different species. We have, and then on the right, I just looked at a seed bag from the commercial mix from last year. So there's a couple things I want to mention. One thing is the exact proportions are going to vary based on cultivar. So like seeds can have different size, like maybe you use a white clover cultivar that has a slightly larger seed. So that's just going to affect the weight of the amount of seed that's in a mix. So for like a commercial mix, just follow what the package says. If it says 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you can kind of trust that they've done those calculations of to base on seed size and whatnot. But just as a general rule, you can kind of see like about 4.5 pounds of fine fescues, a few ounces of the white clover, an ounce or two of the self-heal, and then a very small amount at that creeping thyme. That seed is very tiny. So I do want to mention, if you're not familiar with the fine fescues, we do have planting a fine fescue lawn. The fine fescues are a group of 5 different species that can be within a mix for bee lawns, or if you buy a mix of fine fescues separately. So if you want to learn more about those different species, you can visit our website of fine fescue lawns from the University of Minnesota Extension. So I've mentioned you have to choose the time and you have to choose the technique in which you establish. So I kind of realized that you might not know timing of both of these operations with together. So I have kind of like a timeline. So if you plant in the spring, regardless of whether you renovate or overseed, you're going to prepare the site in that mid-May to late May timeframe. And then you prepare the site right before planting. So when it's time to plant, you just prepare the site. Dormant seeding is a little bit different. So if you're dormant seeding and overseeding, so you want to overmow or mow super short at the last mow of the season. And that's not going to be the same exact time that you plant. So you want to wait a little, so you get your lawn prepped when it's still basically the end of the growing season. Then you wait till your mid-November time, or maybe even early December to actually plant the seed. So the other option is dormant seeding and renovation. So that is, getting rid of that vegetation, you're not going to be able to do that in winter, for example. You need to do that pretty much in fall. So things like if you're using an herbicide like glyphosate, there's certain temperature ranges that it's active at. So you need to do your site prep in fall. Or if you wanted to do, sheet mulching or solarization, you're going to have to basically do that in summer because it takes time for those techniques. So then you're allowing time to go by, and you're seeding again, like I said, mid-November, early December after the growing season is done. So fertilizing is something that you can, if you're familiar with establishing a lawn, fertilizing is something that you can do at planting. Bee lawns are very similar to a regular lawn. So if you're starting a bee lawn in the spring, you would use a starter fertilizer. And if you go to the hardware store, your garden center, just go to the lawn care section, and they have what's called lawn starter fertilizers. And that's the same exact thing that you can use for a bee lawn. When you dormant seed, you do not need to fertilize. You just wait till it's established the following year, and you can kind of establish just the fertilizing regimen that you plan to use, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Okay, so hopefully now you're still following me. We have seed on the ground now. Based on your whatever B-lawn mix that you chose. So if you've prepared the site and you've put down the seed using your method of choice, there is an additional step that you need to do to get the seed a little into the soil a little bit better. You can rake lightly, or you can and then so for a renovation, that's where the soil is completely bare. You can rake lightly, and then you can roll it, and that just makes the soil to seed contact really good. You can kind of tamp it down too. For overseeding, so you can imagine you have vegetation there. It's a little bit harder to do things like do a lot of different things like rolling, but you still can kind of lightly rake that in, kind of working around the existing vegetation as you need to. There's a tool that that you can kind of see at the bottom of this picture here called a hand spiker. And that's pretty effective too. So it's just kind of you just kind of hand roll it, and it works the seed into the soil lightly. You don't want the seed to be too deep. It's just kind of working it in a little bit. And with dormant seeding, again, with the least work option, you don't have to. You can rake it lightly if you want, but most of the time in most winters, the freeze thaw cycle that happens over winter just naturally works that seed into the soil. Okay, so with renovation, there's these things called, maybe some of you are familiar with this, called seeding blankets or germination blankets that are used to establish lawns. So what those are, they're a thin blanket of biodegradable mulch. What they do is protecting the soil from erosion, and also retains moisture in the soil. When we do our research, we're very regularly using these blankets. So you probably, actually, most people would be familiar with seeing them on the side of the highway. Like whenever there's any kind of slope, they provide a lot of protection from the seed being washed away. So those can, depending on what type of yard that you have and what kind of site that you want to establish in, those might be something that you might consider using. We have started to do some research. This is my colleague, Andy Holman. He's a fellow researcher in the turfgrass group. So he's been doing B-lawn work from the start, like about 10 years ago. And he's been establishing turfgrass at a research site for a long time now. So he started this new research project that I'm gonna discuss briefly here on dormant seeding. So we know, we do things as researchers, and it's easy for us because we've been doing this for years, but not everyone has been doing these things for years. So we're trying to think of ways to make it easier for just anyone to establish things. And Andy had this idea of, in the fall, killing turf grass, like if you want to establish a B-lawn, or if you want to switch to a different type of turf grass, where you kill the turf grass with an herbicide in the fall, and then you leave that mulch. It's kind of like a homemade seeding blanket. Leave that there, and then you seed into that. So what he did was he did a dormant seeding experiment where part of it was seeding blanket, part of it was bare soil, and part of it was killed turfgrass foliage. And within this dormant seeding trial, one of the treatments was a B-lawn mix. So I'm going to show you a little bit what we see in this trial. So here's a close-up of a seeding blanket in the spring after having been dormant seeded. And if you look really closely, there's little tiny blades of grass that are poking up in there. And over time, that biodegradable mulch will decompose, and the turf just fills in really nicely. This particular type of seeding blanket has a plastic mesh in it, and that does need to be removed at some point. But I guess if I were doing it at my home, I would use the stuff that doesn't have the mesh. I don't have any slopes. So you don't need that extra stabilization. You can just use the stuff that doesn't have that if you want. So anyway, the results of that trial that Andy did, this is the next spring after having been dormant seeded. So what he found was things established best under the seeding blankets. The next best establishment was under the dead turf. So that's kind of like the homemade seeding blanket. And then what performed the least well was the bare soil. So we don't think this is representative of every single year. This is 2020, the spring of 2023. And in our region, we had these very hot and dry very early in the year. And we didn't have our irrigation turned on at the research center, so we couldn't water. But what we think what happened was things probably germinated and they didn't have enough water on that bare soil. But under the germination blanket and under the dead turf, there was still some moisture retention in the soil. And so those did well. But Andy wrote an article on our blog if you're interested in more of what he did with this demo. So for the B-lawn results within this trial, we found that creeping thyme did not establish under the blanket or under the bare soil. And the bare soil, like I mentioned, things didn't do very well in general. We're wondering if that seeding blanket is a little bit too heavy of a protection for creeping thyme. Creeping thyme, like I mentioned, has very tiny seeds. And so we think, well, it probably might have been a little bit too heavy of a mulch for it to establish. And so what else? Another thing that we found is the white clover and the self-heal. In this particular picture is from the dead turf foliage. They did bloom in the first year. That's pretty. That's what we would expect, especially white clover that blooms relatively quickly. Self-heal may or may not bloom that first year, but in this particular year, it did start to bloom in year one. The creeping thyme, when it did establish, it doesn't usually bloom the first year. It usually takes a while to establish. So you can see in this picture that that's a B-lawn. It has all three of the flowering plants in there, plus the fine fescues. So you might have gathered from this research trial that we should do more research on finding ways to consistently establish B-lawns. And we have this new grant. So we're pretty excited about this. And this is funded by CFANS, that's a college at the University of Minnesota, of increasing establishment success for B-lawns. So we're going to examine different ways, different times of year to plant, different things that people can do with a focus on not just people like us who are researchers in turfgrass, but for people like you who may need a little extra help and a little extra insurance that you're going to do well with your B-lawn establishment. We'll keep everyone updated on how this research goes. Okay, so going away from the research and back to things that you can do now. So seed mix options. There are commercially available B-lawn mixes, and you might have gathered based on what I mentioned already. That's a perfect choice for you to use. You can go to your garden center and it's already mixed for you, and you can just rely on the directions as far as how much to use for your area. Within our region, something that's labeled that U of M B lab, that's going to be based on our mix, which is the self-heal, the creeping thyme, and the white clover. You also can buy commercially available forbs only. So that will just be a mix that just have flowers. So maybe if maybe if you're overseeding, you already have turf grass that's pretty healthy. Maybe you want to consider just using that forbs only mix. Some people might even consider just using one or two of the forbs. So you can see on the shelf at my garden center, you can just buy things like Dutch white clover on their own. The other species, many different seed companies will sell creeping thyme or self-heal. So you can find that available lots of different places. So you might think, well, should I mix my own? So examples of why you might tailor your seed mix are, I've kind of already foreshadowed this. Maybe you don't need, you don't want olive in your lawn. Maybe you don't like self-heal. You think it looks a little bit too coarse. You don't have to have all of the forbs. You can still benefit pollinators by just having, just white clover or the creeping thyme. Maybe you would think about tailoring your mix for that. Another reason you might tailor your mix is if you have like if you like Kentucky bluegrass, but then you want the bee lawn mixes or the bee lawn flowers in there as well, then you might not use the commercial mix because the commercial mix has the fine fescues in there. One good thing about Kentucky bluegrass is it's more tolerant of traffic. And then again, maybe you have white clover already in your lawn and you're kind of happy with that already. So maybe you just want to supplement a certain species like creeping thyme or self-heal. But as I mentioned, these things of why you might want to tailor your mix, I would probably just go with the commercially available mix. It's just the easiest option. You don't really have to do too much thinking with that. You can just follow the instructions. Because I brought up the aspect of just using one of the species, I just want to point out, so for the bee lawn mix, that includes all the species, you're going for 4 to 5 pounds per 1,000 feet. If you were to just use one of the species on its own, like say you have a Kentucky bluegrass lawn and you want white clover in there, you don't plant 4 or 5 pounds of white clover. You just plant a similar amount to what you would that would be included in the mix. So that means like for white clover, you would plant like 1 to 3 or 4 ounces for 1,000 square feet. And why whether you go to the higher or the lower end of that range is just depends on how much instant gratification you would like, and also what density of white clover you would like. So obviously, if you plant more, you're going to have a higher proportion of white clover. So in planting something like a single species on its own, like say you were going to just plant white clover in an overseeding situation. So the seed, is a lot smaller than 4 to 5 pound, that 4 to 5 pound bag that you're planting. So you can do something like mix it with sand, and that will help you more evenly distribute it over your area because you're just planting this a smaller amount of seed. Okay, so you might wonder about other flowers besides what's in the standard commercial mix of bee lawn. We don't have a grant for this, but we are just on our own. We're looking at other species, particularly with a focus on native species. Things like violets. So the common violet actually is a native species, and that is kind of considered a weed in your lawn. And it is relatively aggressive, but there's other native violet species. So things like prairie violet and birdfoot violet. There's other native species like wild petunia. So we have like a demo plot where we're starting to include these species, and we're going to see how well they do as far as being mowed, their tolerance to mowing, and if they're still blooming at low heights, and whether or not they're attracting pollinators. So we're looking at this, and probably in the future we'll be doing more work in research-based work on how these species do in a bee lawn. So I did mention that other researchers across the country are doing work on bee lawns, and in the South, there's the Refuge Lawn Project, and one of the success stories from their research is Spring Beauty. It blooms at a really nice time because it's really early. So that is native to Minnesota as well. So that is a species I'm really excited about, and we have thrown some of that into our demo plots, and we're going to look and see how it does in Minnesota. Okay, all of the bee lawn flowers, they don't have the same adaptation to site conditions. They do vary some, and you can kind of see here Creeping Thyme does a little bit better in full sun, whereas Self-Heal is a little bit more adapted to part sun or part shade. The Dutch white clover, that's the most widely adapted, so that's going to do the best across different conditions. So I have a few recommendations for site conditions. So if you have clay soil, this is a general lawn recommendation, but it applies to bee lawns as well. If you have compacted soil before you plant your bee lawn, it's good to like aerate. Aeration is best done in August to October. You want to use an aerator like I showed in that picture where it's taking little plugs out. That can help relieve compaction in your lawn and also help your bee lawn establish. So if you have a lightly shaded spot, the Self-Heal, the white clover, and the fine fescues are going to be better for part shade or part sun. A very heavy dense shade is often going to be a struggle to get a bee lawn or any kind of lawn established. So in cases of a very dense shade, we actually recommend maybe you should try something like native woodland flowers rather than a bee lawn, because even if you do get things established, things like maybe the white clover will be there, but it's not going to be blooming very much or at all. And that's not really the goal of your bee lawn. You want the flowers there for the bees. So if you have a full sun, sandy soil, and that's the case that I have in my yard, I have found personally that the Self-Heal doesn't do that well under those conditions. Creeping Thyme does much better. So if you have those types of conditions, you can always try any of the species whenever you want. But if you are struggling, maybe with Self-Heal, give Creeping Thyme a shot. And I've mentioned this before, Kentucky bluegrass. You might want to go with a Kentucky bluegrass over the fine fescues if you have higher traffic in your yard. So traffic means like you're walking on it a lot, or people are playing on it, or you have pets. If you want something that's a little bit more tolerant of traffic, Kentucky bluegrass will perform better than fine fescues. And we found Kentucky bluegrass is perfectly fine with these bee lawn species. Okay, so post-seeding care. So this is just immediately after you've planted and things are starting to germinate. So you need to worry about watering, weeding, and mowing. So watering post-seeding. So I've mentioned dormant seeding is less work. So this is another example of that. You don't need to worry about watering that in. But with spring seeding, you do want to water pretty much exactly the way you would establish a lawn. You would do like a longer, deep initial water, and then you would follow with a light and frequent watering. And so that's until it gets established. With a bee lawn, weeding is extremely critical. If you don't get those weeds at establishment, it will turn into, this isn't the exact same site, but it's just an example. So if you see on the left, all of those weeds are germinating. Eventually they'll get larger and larger and they'll crowd out all the grasses that are trying to grow there. So you do need to control weeds. It's very critical because you, for the most part, cannot use herbicides with a bee lawn. I'm going to show a little bit of seedling identification just because it might help you with weeding. When your bee lawn starts to grow and you have something like fine fescues in there, there's pretty much, there's not a lot of weeds that look like turf grasses when they're germinating. They have very fine leaf. So things like crabgrass, those are going to have a much wider leaf. So for the most part, you're not going to mistake those. So the flowers that are in a bee lawn mix, this is a kind of a picture of what those look like when they're germinating. Unfortunately, there's a lot of weeds that kind of look like some of these. So I would be careful with weeding when things are at this stage. So like Self-Heal, like there's 3-seeded mercury and it kind of looks the same. Or like the white clover seedling, when it's very small, it kind of looks like spurge. As I've mentioned before, Creeping Thyme has a tiny seed. It also has a tiny seedling. So again, it's a little hard to tell at this stage unless you're a pro. As they get older, it's a little bit more easy to tell what's what. So white clover, you'll start to see things like what's called a watermark, which is that white mark that's on the leaf. It's kind of it varies, the pattern varies depending on the plant. Creeping thyme, an easy way to tell what that is there's a couple of weeds that look similar, but creeping thyme will have a kind of a very distinct thyme fragrance, kind of like an herby, like a fragrance. Self-heal is when it looks a little bit like dandelion when it's younger, but it does have kind of a rougher texture compared to dandelion. So that's just kind of like an intro to identification. Okay, so now that things are established, you want to start mowing. This is very similar to a regular lawn. You want to start mowing once your seedlings reach 3 to 4 inches. You've probably heard of the 1/3 rule. You never want to cut more than 1/3 of the herbage or foliage of a lawn at any given time. For bee lawns particularly, you want to mow at a higher height. That allows the flowers to bloom, that allows the pollinators to be able to access those flowers. And in just a quick note, you don't need to do no mow May with a bee lawn because these species that are in a bee lawn, they're adapted to mowing, and actually they'll probably spread and flower more if you do somewhat regular mowing. Okay, so very quickly, maintenance once established. So weed control, like I mentioned, you can hand weed. If you have, you can spot treat if you absolutely need to. You can't broadcast weed or you can't broadcast herbicide. So that means you can't just put herbicides all over your lawn because that's gonna, for the most part, most herbicides are gonna kill your flowers. So you fertilize at more of a lower input type of regimen. So that's like 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen, and that's using your regular lawn fertilizer that you find at the store. If you have fine fescues in your lawn, you don't need as much watering. They're tolerant of less water. And you want to mow at a higher height. The bare minimum at 3. Higher is actually better. Okay, so I mentioned that bee lawns have been this whole research project that started way 10 years ago. It really hasn't been that long in the scheme of studying bee lawns. And we have this project with the MSP LTER, that's a long-term ecological research project, where we are studying what's happening over the long term with bee lawns, because we don't actually know, things are too new still. So we have researchers that are going out, they're looking at bee lawns and they're looking at traditional lawns, and they're monitoring what species are in those lawns. So that's going to be, and also what pollinators are using those lawns. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over time. And that's like another area of research that we'll start to tell people what kind of results we're getting as we progress with this research. Okay, so I'm starting to wrap it up here. So this doesn't really relate to establishment, but this is the most common question that we get for bee lawns. And I always kind of struggle with how to answer, will I get stung? Technically, if you're attracting bees and it's something like a bumblebee or a honeybee, there is a potential. They are capable of stinging, and it is possible to get stung. But recently I heard the answer from one of our entomologists at the U of M as to whether bee lawns and will they get stung, will people get stung. So I'm putting her answer down because she's the expert on insects. So she says that the bees that use a bee lawn, they're mostly non-aggressive. They're solitary bees, and it's just not in their nature to be very aggressive and to purposely go out and cause damage to anyone. And one point that I thought was interesting that she has made was low maintenance lawns already have some of these species in there. So it's even, you might not, you've probably been experiencing a lawn that has white clover or a lawn that has self-heal, because that also occurs as a weed. If you haven't been stung in the past, it's very similar. The hazard is very similar with a bee lawn to a low maintenance lawn. And she says, if things are flowering, and you see bees foraging, don't walk barefoot on that lawn. Don't roll around on the lawn. Maybe just kind of give them their space while they're gathering their food. The Bee Lab at University of Minnesota has all these great resources for pollinators. So you should see what they have to say about planting for pollinators. This is just a lot of good resources on their website. Okay, very quickly. The way back when the bee lawn research was started, that was funded by the LCCMR. So they're responsible for like where we are today in bee lawns because of that funding. We have two current research projects that I mentioned that are funding continuing research with bee lawns. And so we would like to acknowledge them. I'd also just personally like to thank the Bee Lab, University of Minnesota Extension, Forestry Resources, my fellow coworkers at the U of M Turfgrass Science group, and the graduate students whose hard work that bee lawns are based on their research. And also I'd like to thank University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension for inviting me, and all of you for listening to me talk. And I would like to end with my favorite picture of bee lawns, and you should look at this article. It has a lot about the history of bee lawns in that article from Anne Rydell. Well, I'm ready for questions. I hope there's still time.
Yes, thank you, Kristine, so much for being here with us today and sharing so much of your knowledge and research and enthusiasm for bee lawns and pollinators. It has been a pleasure, and we will take a few questions. I would like to remind our listeners before we get to those questions, I just would like to remind you that our program is being recorded, and we will make the recording available on our Extension Horticulture website in the programs archive, our online programs archive. And the list of resources that Chris has provided will also be made available. So there's a lot going on with this topic, and we have the recording and resources for follow-up. So now on to a couple questions. I think one of the things that has come up the most in the Q&A box is questions about natives versus non-natives. And do bees care if the plants are native or non-native? When the bee mixes were put together, where did that fit into the conversation?
Okay, so this is the history of bee lawns, and they started with more native species. So that includes I think it's calico aster. There was a coreopsis, and there was one other species that ground plum. So they started out with more native species way back when. There were more difficulties in establishing those species. I didn't really talk about this too much, but we do know some things about these species. So white clover, it does have high quality nectar, and it has high quality pollen. So that is a known, and that does benefit, even though white clover isn't a native, it does benefit native bees. So knowing the quality of the food from the flowers, if someone has examined that, then we can determine that whether or not it's a good food for bees. Does that answer that question? We want to use more natives. We definitely do, and we're looking at that more. But for right now, we just know that these species are successful at establishing, it's successful at living under those conditions, and successful in providing pollinators food.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. So thank you for that. We're going to try to fit in a few more here. There are a lot of white clovers out there. What should we look for if we want to mix our own, or maybe just want to add some of the white clover? What should we look for in a white clover?
So that's a great question. You can, what is in the bee lawn mix is a variety. There's like 3 main types of white clover. So there's like, and that have different uses, but What if you're just going off the shelf and looking for white clover on its own, you want to find Dutch white clover. I also can recommend that if white clover is already in your lawn, so that's the kind of like the wild type that is naturalized basically all throughout the world. The wild type is valuable. It's not exactly the same as Dutch white clover, but it is still providing a lot of benefits. There's another, yet another kind of clover called micro clover. I don't think that you need to use micro clover. So I was just in a talk yesterday, and there's a researcher who had done work with different clovers, and this is anecdotally the case that we have found, and I just my limited experience as well, that micro clover starts to revert to what the wild type is anyway. So it's supposed to stay pretty small and flower less actually, but I've not seen very much difference in it, and I know it's more expensive. So I would just go with a Dutch white clover, or if you have it occurring naturally in your yard, just try to promote that by not using herbicide. It'll just start to grow on its own as well.
Great. About mowing our lawn, if we have some of the bee lawn species preferred or that are preferred and we have some of those in our lawn, what should we be thinking about in terms of mowing? The timing of when we mow, timing during the day, as well as how frequently we mow.
So yes. So if you're letting your lawn grow to a higher height, if you've adjusted your mower to a higher height, you actually just kind of you're naturally going to be mowing less, because if you're mowing it 2 inches and then waiting until it grows to 3 inches, that means that you're mowing it more frequently over the course of the summer. But you want to yes. So you want to not mow when you see a bunch of flowers. You just let it grow a little longer, and that's not, you don't want it to go so long that you're taking off more of the herbage, like half of the herbage instead of following the 1/3 rule. But yes, so if it's flowering, wait a few more days to mow. The time of day, you can see when the bees are active. So if it's later in the day mowing, that's fine. But in the middle of the day, that's probably not best for your lawn anyway, because that's when the heat of the lawn is. When you see a lot of bees, they're often quite active in the middle of the day. So yes, you can avoid that time of day.
All right, we're going to fit in one more. I think a lot of people are wondering, do I really have to go through a lot of prep? Like my lawn, I have a lot of bare spots already. I don't really, it's maybe a little unkept. I have some weeds, I have some dandelions. Like, can I do this without really doing a true renovation?
I think you can, especially if your goals aren't to make everything perfect. Some people have different aesthetics, people have different goals. If you want things to be perfect and pretty, maybe yes, you would want to do a renovation and start from scratch and have everything be nice and perfect and try to keep it that way. If you have more of a lower input lawn already, you do need to do some work to get things going. It's more of a initial work, like I've mentioned, with watering a little bit more until things get established. If you do things in the spring, like that starter fertilizer, that's really going to help you get things going. If you and then maybe you want to go a little more on the heavier side for fertilizing to get things filled in, and then kind of revert back to a lower maintenance level of fertilizing. So those are some things you can do. And honestly, you can. I always think people are too scared to experiment. You can give it a shot, try a small area, and see how it goes. And what's the worst that can happen?
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. So again, I just want to thank Kristine for joining us today and sharing so much of her passion and knowledge with us. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and participating in our University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension Horticulture program online program today. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you again on one of our upcoming webinars. Bye-bye.